Welcome. My name is Forrest Longman, and I am the president of City Club. The mission of City Club is to inform, connect, and engage our community to strengthen the civic health of our region. We emphasize civil conversations and listening to others. We begin by acknowledging with humility that the land where we are today is the territory of the people of the Salish Sea. Their presence is imbued in the waterways, shorelines, valleys, and mountains of the traditional homelands of the Coast Salish people, and has been this way since time immemorial. As always, I'd like to thank all of our volunteers who make our programs possible. I'd like to thank KMRE radio board member Robert Clark, who is producing today's program, and BTV10, who will be broadcasting it to their viewers. I'd also like to thank our sponsors for their support. They are Bruce and Claudia Dyson, the Opportunity Council, Baron Smith Dogger of Attorneys at Law, Lummi Commercial Company, Danny Neal of the Mulliat Group, Colshan CPAs, Pacific Continental Realty, Unity Care Northwest, Village Books, Western Washington University, Whatcom Community College, and the Whatcom Community Foundation. Next month, our City Club program will be Crypto and NFTs 101. Our speaker, Jennifer Greenwald, an award-winning graphic designer and the creative VP of Fishfort, a crypto security company, will discuss the potential risks and rewards for investors and the steps regulators are planning to protect investors. Finally, I'd like to turn things over to Tim Douglas. Tim is a former mayor of Bellingham and a member of the City Club Program Committee. He'll introduce our speaker and moderate today's program. Tim?
Thanks very much, Forrest. Today's program is one of real importance given the pandemic that we're enduring right now and seem to be going on ad nauseum, but it's youth mental health in the age of anxiety and why it matters to everyone. We're delighted to have today a speaker who has really steeped in this particular question for children of all ages, particularly teens and young adults. Dr. Cislina Ledbetter is the executive director at Western Washington University for Counseling, Health, and Wellness. Cislina has her BA degree in psychology from North Carolina Central University, both an MA and PhD in social psychology from Howard University in Washington, DC, and has also undertaken and completed postgraduate studies at both Georgetown and Harvard universities in the areas of educational leadership. You know, this speaker has a really diverse and interesting set of experiences with her. For one thing, while she was in Washington, DC, she hosted a regular cable TV show called A Healthy Mind. And frankly, we are all looking forward to such a program someday here in Bellingham and Whatcom County, since we are all interested in exploring the health of our minds. She has certainly done interesting research in a number of areas, including on addictions, but also on suicidal thinking and behavior, and many other things that relate to mental health. As a social psychologist and a researcher, she has also been a life coach. And oh my gosh, Dr. Ledbetter, what have you not done? But so much is related to well-being, and we are really looking forward to your comments in this regard. So, Dr. Ledbetter.
Thank you so much, Tim. This is exciting. What have I not done? I haven't done this yet. So I'm excited to be here with City Club, and I'm really thrilled to have this conversation with you all today. I am going to share my screen, and I'm going to be moving pretty quickly. Awesome. All right, so we're going to be talking about mental health and challenges in youth and young adults. All right, so this is going to be like fire hose. So I'm going to move really quickly. All right, so this is me. You don't need to see this slide. I'm at Western, work with U.S. Health Promoting Network. So collective trauma and connection. 2020 was a doozy of a year. It was the beginning of a cycle of collective trauma where no segment of the population on this planet went unscathed. We're really marching through that right now as we speak. It exposed weaknesses in all of our systems, our political systems, our social system, healthcare, educational, environmental. Every single system was stressed. And I think some people were perplexed and still remain perplexed about how we have, as a society and as humans, sort of spiraled. And in some ways, as our system have devolved, we as humans are still navigating our way through this COVID, and it has taxed our mental health system. And so what we are looking for is collective community and connection. And so just to give you a sense of what happened, this happened. March 2020, COVID happened, and we were all trying to figure out what was happening. Our healthcare workers, we had compassion fatigue, caring for other people, physical fatigue, exhaustion, job loss that was not voluntary. Then we had the Great Resignation that was voluntary, supply chain disruptions. Over 900,000 people have transitioned this earth and counting. We've had multiple variants, and our brains quickly experienced overload. And then this happened. All of us can relate. We were working at home and there were blurred lines, and it's not lost on me the irony of me showing you a Zoom screen with people on Zoom, and we're in Zoom on a virtual platform, and our kids were working virtually. And for the introverts among them, they were having an amazing time. But for those kids who needed some connection, there was struggle. And the same happened for parents. And so this is a quick video, but I want to make sure that you understand a little bit about the clinical aspects of what happens. Oh, I did have it on.
Our brains are under prolonged stress. The strain of daily precautions, like wearing masks and physical distancing, are getting to us. Terms like pandemic fatigue and caution fatigue are being coined to describe what's happening to us and our resistance. Our brains are part of the problem and the solution.
For example, if we're walking through the woods and see something out of the corner of our eye that resembles a snake, we can have a fear response before we even process what we've seen. A reflex of the brain involving the amygdala and the hippocampus. And then that information is processed by higher parts of our brain called the cerebral cortex, which will actually register whether or not there's a snake. And if it is a snake, is it poisonous? But the brain causes a very quick fight or flight response, which is very useful when trying not to die on a daily basis.
Our brain is designed to keep us safe from imminent danger, but it's also good at de-escalating that fear.
The brain has the capacity to overcome the reaction to danger. It's good that the brain does this. It's really not healthy to have chronic elevated levels of the stress hormone cortisol in our bloodstreams. Prolonged stress really does cause problems, and we see this with soldiers in prolonged combat. We know that high levels of cortisol for a long time actually appear to shrink the hippocampus and further potentially undermine our ability to detect what is safe from what isn't safe.
In a way, it is this self-protective ability of the brain to integrate and put things into context, to relax. That is the problem now. With COVID-19, the danger may not be evident in our day-to-day lives, so we lose our motivation. We get lazy.
As we have the experience of, I went to the store a couple of weeks ago and I'm still not sick. So we developed this false sense of security in situations where we should be still vigilant. We have to train ourselves and develop safe habits, like always having extra masks in the car, in our pockets, purses, briefcases, at work, and at home, so that they're there when we need them. So it's very different from something that looks like a snake. It's very different from being in the dark and hearing a noise. It's not instinctual. It requires development of habits, just like we brush our teeth every day. And that's to prevent a future threat. not just the immediate threat.
So be smarter than your brain. Remember that the COVID-19 risk is still there. And practice good precaution habits for your own safety, for the community, for the world.
That basically tells us that COVID-19 and the prolonged response that we have is one that has triggered our fight or flight. In fact, there was a study at Stanford that said even looking at yourself on the Zoom screen for prolonged periods of time can evoke the fight or flight response. So this happened. And so this also, we're right in there when we talk about mental health. The killings of Breonna Taylor, of George Floyd, the riots that ensued, the protests that ensued, and then this happened. This is a caption, September 10, 2020. Police in the US killed 164 Black people in the first 8 months of 2020. These are their names. So this happened. And then this happened, January 6th. We're still talking about mental health because so many people of color and Black people in particular felt like this was an attack on their way of life. And I'm still talking about mental health. And then this happened. Every Black family, every Latinx family, every white family, every family in America, this was my son, had to be forced to have that conversation with their children about what is going on in America. And so we either told them the truth or we made something up, but everybody was faced, everybody with children or grandchildren was faced with this conversation about what is going on in this place called America. Thankfully, in the information age, I believe, regardless of what we try to keep from our children, they are going to seek the truth. And then this happened: anxiety, grief, despair, sadness, loss. Over 60,000 children lost at least one parent. Take that in for a second. 60,000 children lost at least one parent. Can you imagine that one person dying has an impact on dozens? And if they had a big life, hundreds, thousands of people that may have experienced the grief and loss. And so I heard one psychologist describe what we're going through as a collective state of grief, that we're all grieving. We're grieving a loss of what was to be. We're grieving a loss of what will be. We're grieving a loss of what we thought was normal and thought we were comfortable in, and only for the cloud to be lifted and for us to say, well, normal didn't protect us. And so these are just tools in terms of what can we do when we are experiencing or sharing with someone who is grieving. Be a good listener, respect their way of grieving, accept mood swings, avoid giving advice. Sometimes when you are dealing with someone who is grieving, you just listen, because COVID has absolutely stressed all of our systems. And then this happened, more grief. Our adults are grieving, our children are grieving, our parents are grieving, our dogs are grieving, our cats are grieving. I never forget when I made this connection where I talked to 3 or 4 people within the span of a couple of months, and everybody was talking about their pet either getting sick or passing away. And what I said to them is, our pets resonate and feel and take in our energy, and they have an absolute exchange with us. And so they're even experience grief and loss. So our pets are sick and dying. And if you have a pet that has been sick in a disproportionate way, I don't know if you can drop a 1 in the chat and communicate, but drop a 1 in the chat if your pet has been sick. Our teachers are sick. Where do you go when the people that are responsible for taking care of people are sick? Our healthcare professionals have been grieving. And so this has been a challenging time, because unlike when things happen that are isolated, right? You think about Katrina. I have a friend who works with crisis response, and he talks about Katrina was isolated, and the storm in Texas was isolated. But when you think about everybody being impacted, it's another level. And so that was just as late a context to tell you that if you are feeling exhausted and stressed, and your kids are feeling out of sorts, and your animals are feeling out of sorts, and the caregivers in your lives, your medical professionals, you have every reason to be. I am here to tell you, you have every reason to be. So we're just going to take a snapshot of mental health among you. We're going to talk about where Washington State fares in that. I'm going to talk to you about some ideas and opportunities for addressing mental health challenges right here in Bellingham and Whatcom County. And we're going to discuss some of the well-being work and the progress that we're making at Western. So this is just a snapshot, right? Where do your eyes go? This is a snapshot. And to think about, this is 21-22, recent data, Mental Health of America. All of this data, and I have references in the back, will be coming from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, the CDC, Mental Health America. So all of these data points that I'm going to be presenting you come from those slides. So 50 million people, or 19.8% of adults, have experienced mental illness in 2019. I can't really talk to you about just youth without helping you understand that the people in their lives, the adults that are in their lives, are also struggling. And so it's one of those things, when I talk about systems level change, you can't just talk about one set of folks without understanding the impact on the other systems levels. So over 60%, right? Over 60%, 1 in 3 youth with major depressive episodes do not receive any mental health treatment. You can listen to that, right? So 15.8% of youth experience a major depressive episode in the past year. That is huge. 2.5 million youth in the US have severe major depression. This rate was highest among youth who identify with more than one race. And so we know that these youth are much more vulnerable for many reasons. Some are reflected in the slides that I just shared with you, but they are struggling and they tend to be less likely to receive care. Yes, what you were thinking, in terms of the picture that I was going to paint, it's not a great one. The young youth mental health is worsening and has been. And so this is one of those things that mental health professionals struggle with, because now we're talking about, everybody is talking about mental health and stress, and anxiety is up, depression is up, suicidal ideation is up, and suicide completion is up. And one of the things that we've already known is that when COVID hit, we were already in a crisis, but what happened is it escalated. And so the numbers all, particularly numbers in college mental health went up. Numbers for students that were K through 12 increased. The numbers have doubled. Can you imagine the taxing that it has had on our healthcare system? And for those who are in the LGBTQI community, more than 3 times of them who identify as are more likely to identify are considered suicidal. So right here, 2019, 46.8% of youth that identify as gay, lesbian, or bisexual reported seriously considering suicide. That is tragic, and those are the numbers. And so when you think about the youth, we are in crisis, y'all. COVID-19 exacerbated these trends. Thing to think about here, in 2020, 51% of 11 to 17-year-olds reported having thoughts of suicide. 51% of our babies are contemplating thoughts of suicide, and we can have a whole conversation about the role that social media has played in this, but we won't go there. But I'll tell you that if you could encourage your children or grandchildren to go on a regular media fast, it would be good for mental health. Carol Dweck is a researcher out of University of Texas, Austin, that talks about the me generation and how narcissism is feeding into this whole idea of what I look like and what I feel like and who's look like they're doing so amazing. It plays into the mentality of our youth, and it's really damaging. And so compared to 2019, in 2020, children's visit to the emergency room for mental health conditions increased. 31% for 12 to 17, 24% for those 5 to 11 in serious dire straits. Access to care is lacking. 43% of youth within the past year had a major depressive episode. and received any mental health treatment in 2019. So what we know, because of health disparities that, COVID has really helped us unpack, is that white youth are more likely to receive mental health services, certainly more likely than Black youth, Hispanic youth. And what we know also is what you don't see here is Indigenous, because oftentimes they, like the book Asterisk, they often are not represented because the numbers are so low, right? Of our youth who do not receive mental health services, 70 to 80% of them receive them at school. What's important about this is that when schools close, and I think I'm gonna have a slide a little bit later, but when schools close, the impact on Black and Latinx youth is intense. It's really heightened because this is typically where Black and Latinx youth get their mental health support. So when schools close, they're not going to psychiatrists and physicians outside of school. These students suffer greatly. So in this slide, I really just wanted to highlight that 23.1% of the total activities of daily living, the total burden for students is related to mental health, 23%. And the only thing that's higher than mental health in terms of the contributions to burden of disease is accidents in terms of death. It's the number 2 cause of death, suicide right now among our youth, which is a really sad commentary in our country. So glass half full or glass half empty. So I want you to drop a 1 in the chat and communicate with each other. If you think about this situation as glass half full, and a 2 if you think about it as glass half empty. And I want you to take a look at your responses. Are you a glass half full or a glass half empty? So what's happening at Western? And I can tell you that these data are coming from the Healthy Minds study. The Healthy Minds study is an annual web-based survey that examines the mental health services, service utilization, and related issues among undergraduate and graduate students at colleges and universities. It launched in 2007, and it is fielded at over 400 colleges and universities with over 550,000 responses. I can tell you that one of the things that you're going to see here is that our data at Western mirrors national trends. And my therapist would absolutely co-sign on this and say to you that every negative indicator around mental health has increased. So therapy appointments have gone up almost to 40% from 2017 to 2020. Psychiatric medication is on the rise. Lifetime diagnosis of mental disorders is up. Because how many of you know that the first time that you're going to likely see an onset of a mental illness is at 14? And if you don't see it at 14, the next time is likely at 24. And that's when they're in college. And so sometimes students come and they don't realize that they're vulnerable, right? But they absolutely could experience a major depressive episode or a mental health episode when they're in college. Suicidal ideation is up. Ideation just means not only have I thought about suicide, but I've actually thought about the plan. So that is the difference when someone says they're suicidal. And so when you're doing the assessments, my team is asking questions like, what is it? How do you plan on doing it, right? Suicidal, we really thought about it. Non-suicidal self-injury, cutting, right? That's up. Huge. Doesn't necessarily mean it's a predictor for suicide, right? Because it's non-suicidal self-injury. That's cutting. And you may have, children or grandchildren that do cutting, and that's simply to relieve the pain. They want to recreate physical pain so that they can get relief from emotional and the mental pain. Eating disorders up, really high. Anxiety disorder and depression and major depressive disorder up. More information on national data, college days, and anxiety. And I wanted to drop this slide in to show you that nationally, in general, there are some things that students, particularly Black students and Latinx students who have gone through challenges in their lives, there's a level of resilience There are researchers that think about the levels of resilience that these students bring to them with college campuses. So a student who has actually made it on a college campus that is Black or Latinx comes with a level of resilience. So in terms of being able to report anxiety, depression, ADHD, self-harm, they may be less likely to report it. But when you start thinking about levels of feeling of overwhelm and of control, that's when those numbers start to creep back up, right? So that I thought that was an interesting thing to share. So prevalence of mental illness. The higher the number, the worse you are. Washington State is 49 in terms of depressive episodes. So when asked you with at least one major depressive episode in the past year, 2021 data, Washington State ranked 49th out of 51. New Mexico was 50, Oregon was 51. The national average is 15%. So you can see that we are above average, and there are all kinds of speculations about why that might be. We know that childhood depression, if you don't get ahead of it, if you don't treat it, if you don't, that I'm not talking about just medication, because I don't necessarily subscribe to medication as a first pass when you start talking about childhood depression. But if you go untreated, if you're ignoring the signs, if you're not getting in your children's faces, if you're not asking your grandchildren how you're doing, tell me what you mean by good, right? As my son would say, good. What does that mean? What did you do today? How are you doing really? Tell me some things. Let's have a conversation. If you don't treat that in advance, then the depression can absolutely become major depression in adulthood, right? Overall, 10.6% of our youth, over 2.5 million, cope with severe major depression, right? Rates of depression were the highest among youth who identified as more than one race, right? So we know that, as I just shared, that those who are Black, Latinx, and Indigenous are more likely to have severe major depression. And then 60% of those who have major depression do not receive any mental health treatment, which is pretty sad, and has obviously, as I said earlier, has not gotten better with COVID. Youth experiencing major depressive episodes continue often to go untreated, and often in states with fewer resources. Our state is not, I think we are 13th in the country in terms of access to mental health resources, even though our systems are strained. But having the availability of mental health care providers and linking that with the people who need the services is a sticky widget, because it doesn't always match up. And there are many reasons for that. Nationally, only 27.2% of our youth with severe depression receive consistent treatment. So as we know, treatment for a lot of folks is going to look like going to the emergency room and then having the youth follow up. You say follow up with your provider, and oftentimes in communities of color, that doesn't happen because there's no provider to follow up with, right? And so they don't follow up. They get the panacea, they get the drug, or they get the cognitive behavioral therapy, they get the breathe, and they get all of these, the clinical treatments for that episode, but they often don't have anyone to follow up with. And so if you don't have 7 to 25 visits a year, that's considered consistent treatment. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for youth ages 10 to 18 in the United States. This is heartbreaking, because I think that this is absolutely preventable, but I think it's going to take, those of us who are, in the United States to think very differently about engaging with our kids and engaging early, and not using the computers and laptops and screens that they are in love with as their babysitters. They have to be away from some screen time. As screen time goes up, it seems like suicide, depression, suicidal ideation, and anxiety increases. And so the prevalence of suicide is just way too high. Okay. This is a pretty, I think, common but pretty sad commentary. When we think about people who are untreated, this is the criminalization of mental illness. And I remember having a case like this in my former campus. Untreated mental illness, people with mental illness are 16 times more likely to be killed in a police officer encounter than other civilians. Why is that? Because sometimes there are folks who have mental illness, and they present with unstable looking behavior, right? And so what looks like a threat to a police officer is just someone who may be neurodiverse, may be experiencing a panic attack, may be experiencing an episode where they're highly stressed and they flail and they see that as a threat. And then the guns, the shots are fired and then they're killed. And so we did a lot of training on my last campus and worked very closely with officers on what it looks like and when identifying students who they might want to think twice about for the benefit of the student, particularly those who had issues around neurodiversity. And then I think I've shared this more than once, right? So that we know that disparities in the type of mental health for treatment for students of color and people of color. So there is absolutely a disparity. And so I wanted to drop this slide in because when you take a look at folks, and this is Chesley Chris, who died by suicide on January 30th. And Miss Chris was the Miss USA 2019. And why this is important is she's 29 years old, 30 years old, and really disgusted with her life. And her last social media post was, "I hope you all are happy." And so she was engaging with this platform, you know, that our children are watching. And how do I know that this is impactful? Because our student visits, our students of color reached out and said, "Cislina, I lost someone who I loved very much." Had they ever met her? No. But these types of events that go on in our world are impacting our students. They're impacting our youth, even at the K through 12 level. And when they see this, they don't know how to process it because they look at these people and they think that they have it all together. And so this is Miss Alabama. She just passed away on February 18th. Miss Alabama, Sozo Bethel, died after jumping from a high rise. And so this is what, last week. And so I just want you to know that our kids are immersed and varied. Don't think for a second that your kids are not all over social media and that these data that I'm sharing with you are not living in your home. They're living in your home, they're living in my home. So I wanted to think about, with all of this news, right? My natural proclivity is to be here. My natural proclivity is to want to think about hope, to think about resilience, right? We knew that the glass was going to feel like it was half empty, but now I want to give you some insights on how to maybe think about opportunities for building resilience and for coping. And first, I want to start with what not to do. Toxic positivity. That's what not to do, right? Toxic positivity is this new buzzword, but it's meaningful. And it's this thing where everyone goes around and it's overwhelmingly cool. And you say to your friends and to people who have just lost loved ones, it's going to be all right. Don't worry. Look at the bright side. They're no longer in pain. I know you're tired and stressed and overwhelmed, but it's going to be fine. This can appear insensitive and can be really, really painful. And so one of the things that I share with folks is when you are in a space, and sometimes you want to comfort folks, right? Sometimes silence and the touch is enough. Sometimes you can just look at your friend and say, "I love you," and nothing else. Sometimes you can just be in the space and say nothing at all, to let the person know that I see you. I see you. And so toxic positivity is not the place to go when you are trying to comfort folks. And we are in that space now. We're just looking for a way to help each other feel better. And so what are we doing here at Western? We're doing a couple of things. On September 1, 2021, President Randhawa signed the Okanagan Charter. And what this charter did for our institution, it's a charter that was started in UBC in the Okanagan Valley in the British Columbia. And it simply says that we were going to take a salutogenic approach to looking at well-being on campus. That we were going to focus on all of the things that are right about Western. that we're not going to be thinking of a disease pathogenic approach, but what do we have? I say love on campus and in my emails as often as I can, because I can't come to a place and separate my love and my compassion without thinking about the importance of what the human spirit needs. You cannot be at a job 8 to 10 hours a day and feel like you need to separate that from your humanity. And so what do we have in terms of our cultural capital? Think about where you work, your jobs, in your home. How can you think about a salutogenic approach? Think about what your children are doing right, what your family members are doing right, what your institutions are doing right. And so as I think about how I was able to sell this to survive, was not a very hard sell. Thanks to my Vice President, Melinda Husky, not a difficult sell at all. We were able to bring these words. And so now we are bringing these words into our lexicon and thinking about Western as a place where we can flourish. We're thinking about ecological theory, like people, Bronfenbrenner. People are at the nucleus of all of the work that we do. People, place, planet. And so the Okanagan Charter's vision forced us to think about health promotion. What are we doing at our university that is going to help us transform the way that we do our work and the way that we think about well-being and how we center people, places, in the planet, in everything that we do, in our policies, in our practices, and our guidelines. And I have this little post-it on my my office here, and it talks about, it says, rethink everything, challenge all ways of doing everything. And if you do that, you don't have to worry about going back to a normal, because we want to recreate in a world that is going to feel better and do better. Right? And so health promoting universities and colleges infuse health and well-being into everything that we do, from the operations to the business practices and to the academic mandates. So this was on signing day. This was Sabah, and this is Uzma. Why is this important? Because Uzma had called me one day in June of last year and said that I've got some seed money that I'd like to share with you. And when I said, absolutely, yes, we're going to dedicate this to some of the work with the Okanagan Charter, we got together and we signed this ribbon. We cut this ribbon for the vision of this garden. And so on campus, we are going to be installing a healing garden that is going to have fragrant flowers all around. It's going to have a water element that this person from the Whatcom Community Foundation right here has dedicated to our water element, and the person beside her, Christy Parks from Biodesign, designed this beautiful healing garden. And so we are excited about putting this in front of our academic building West, and our students are already excited because they had input into every single element. And so one of the things that the Okanagan Charter was light on was a leaning towards some of the things that were unique to America, right? America's original sin when we think about racism and racial justice. And so we are partnering with all of the information that we should find in the Steve Fund. We don't need to reinvent the wheel, right? We're talking to stakeholders of color on campus. We're establishing and maintaining a genuinely welcoming, culturally inclusive environment. There are lots of things that we're doing on campus to address that. We just hired a multicultural student services director, and we are really working hard on social justice efforts. So these are our 4 pillars. And honestly, these pillars can be infused in any workplace. We're focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion, the built environment, sustainability, and a culture of health and well-being in everything that we do. So students embarked upon this Okanagan Charter research in 2018, 2019. And so they led this effort. And what we found from their research is that professors are the gatekeepers of their success. These were the findings, that we need to be thinking about economies of well-being. What does that mean? That means that we cannot rely, we cannot therapy our way out of this pandemic. We cannot therapy our way out of this mental health crisis. We have to rely on places and people that infuse well-being and the salutogenic approach in every building, every policy, and every practice on campus, in every classroom, in spaces of leadership. Economies of well-being are going to have to be the way that we think about moving forward. And so I just showed you the healing garden. Our physical environment impacts learning. Students told us this, that our physical environment impacts learning. Think about when you clean your house, whether it's pine sol or Febreze or something else. Think about when you've got everything in order and somebody comes and cleans your house, or you clean it yourself and it feels good and it smells good. Aren't you more productive? Doesn't that physical environment impact the way you move? Right. And so that's what our students told us. And this is a retreat that I had with my counseling center on how to cope. And so we had to sew into the leaders that are responsible for taking care of people that take care of people. And so that's what I see my job as, that I care for people who take care of people. And so we're dealing with coping mechanisms on and off campus. What will this look like? Not a great slide, but this is UBC's concept of well-being. And essentially what this is, students, staff, faculty, and community, we need all of you. Cislina is saying she needs you, City Club, to get the word out, to talk about how you might be able to interface. It's going to look messy before it looks this neat as we continue to build this model. So what are some of the things that we can do? We can expand our services, expand existing services by supplementing community-based services. And this can happen in the school systems, K through 12, K through 20. Expand our services. We don't typically collect data from those who are unhoused. So it's so when we think about this data, that is the one shortcoming, so it is probably underreported, but we need to be able to think community-based and systems-wide, right? Not just about the folks who are actually being served, but because the entire system in COVID has been taxed, we have to think about the people that are actually doing the serving as well. We have to invest in our school counselors. I already told you that our students that are historically underserved, that's where they get their support. So we have to invest in counselors, right? Economies of WellBeing, they're the beginning. Invest in school counselors and evidence-based approaches. There are some really cool evidence-based approaches that are steeped in cognitive behavioral therapy that amazing school counselors, gotta love school counselors, are doing in partnership with teachers to serve our students that are struggling at the K through 12 level. We have to be able to invest in expand training, right? We have to expand training for our personnel, for our school behavioral health providers, for our first responders, for those who are most developmentally appropriate. We have to provide research-based interventions, and we simply have to provide the resources and expand the training where it's needed. So you see here, there's a physical screening going on. We know well in this country how to do physical health. I mean, for the most part, we know how to do prevention. There's been in the past, I'm gonna say past 30 years, there has been this shift towards prevention. And so now healthcare providers are starting to do things like provide incentives. If you get screenings, you get, maybe a few dollars off of your healthcare bill. If you, do things like don't smoke or you go get your checkups. We don't do that for mental health. Why? We need to provide incentives for mental health screenings and for behavioral health screenings. And that needs to be done at well child visits. Right now, it doesn't really happen. Right? And so what we know, what the data tells us is that early intervention is necessary to address the needs early, right? So we want to make sure that we stay on top of that. We have to increase systemic supports, invest in payment models that support integrated team-based care for children and families. And this is kind of like, I just did a training on integrated behavioral health, which is kind of a misnomer because it's integrated health. Behavioral health and mental health and physical health are all health. And so when you start thinking about integrating systems, it means that you can have one doctor or care manager who simply knows everything, brings it all together in one system, can track, do population-wide and systems-level populations-based treatment, and know that when Cislina walks in, she just had a conversation with her therapist put her on this drug, so if she's being treated for something else, kidney failure or diabetes, then we need to make sure about looking at the contraindications for those drugs. We need to invest in models that support integrated and team-based care. And why is that a challenge? It's often a challenge because people have, we talked about silos, people have their systems that they're used to, and they want to hold on to those. But we have to get across to integrated care. in order to serve populations better. Expand telehealth. One of the silver linings of COVID was an expansion in telehealth. When we first went and when we first did that pivot, there were all kinds of interstate agreements that said you can use your iPhone and you can do a telehealth visit, whether you were in Washington State and serving somebody in Washington, DC, or whether you were in Maryland and serving someone in North Dakota. You can whip out your iPhone or your Android or your laptop, and we were suspending all of the rules and making sure that people got the help that they needed. We have to be able to prevent, we have to be able to put because we know we've got to deal with PHI, personal healthcare information. We need to put these things in place so that we can expand access of care for children and families, so that families can have access to health visits, and telehealth is one of the ways to do that. The flip side of that is doing the same thing when we talk about expanding broadband. We have to be able to think about broadband access. It's going to be a critical component to any conversation around access and equity. We can't have a conversation about access and equity without having a conversation about broadband. Justice involved youth. We need to make sure that when we think about our youth, that we are not wasting resources, that we recognize that incarceration is a last resort only for youth who have committed serious crimes and cannot be safely placed in a community-based program, right? We need to make sure that we give people an opportunity for restorative justice practice. Where there are none, we need to encourage them. We're going to need communities to come together and support that. We don't need detention facilities that lock students away. We need ways to be able to reintegrate them in. So what does that mean for you moving forward? That means that I'm acknowledging, Cicely is now acknowledging that we've experienced a collective trauma. All of you. We've gone through death. We've gone through, what COVID has done. We've gone through political turmoil, and we've gone, you name it, we've gone through it. Some of us have lost family members. We've lost loved ones. I lost my dad. We lost. And we need to be focusing on collective healing. So some of the stuff that we know, that we learned when we were, little lads and youth ourselves, we know that mindfulness work and breath work works. Reframing, control, flexibility, grace, mercy, all words that I'm using on campus. We have to reframe how we think about this work. We have to relinquish with control, right? And there are all kinds of ways we can go with that. Flexibility, creating alternative spaces to be in heal. We're doing more of that on campus. Practices that heal. You already know about some of these. We're about to embark on our 20 days of giving here at Western. And we're going to take our students away from the conversation about COVID, and we're going to launch a 20-day giving campaign. I just read a book about giving, and it was 29 gifts, I believe was the book. Amazing. And so we're going to shift the conversation to talk about things that move us into a space of healing. And so this next slide is about resources. These are resources that are helpful as you think about the people in your lives that you serve. They are critical. And I have never been in a space where someone did not know that there was a crisis text line where you can text the word home to 741-741, and you could actually get a live counselor. And I tested that myself to see if it works. And then there's suicide prevention line. And there's some changes that are coming up with that suicide prevention line that I'm going to tell you about really briefly. So these are tips, and hopefully you'll be able to go back into these slides, and you'll be able to see, that there are signs, often suicide warning signs, that you can pick up in terms of being able to help the people that you love, the youth in your life that are really important, that you can help to get some support. How many of you know what 988 is? If you do, give yourself a pat on the back or drop a 1 in the chat. We're going to be implementing 988 countrywide. There are some states who have already moved forward with it. Utah, Oregon, Indiana, and Colorado already have legislation to implement. 13 states that are ranked at the bottom have not. I don't think Washington State is one, but by July of 2022, 988 is going to ensure that mental health crisis can be met with a mental health response and not with law enforcement, right? Because that's often what happens. What did I say? 16 times more likely to die if it's met with mental health, because you don't often know, right? Officers think that they're in a threat. So for non-emergency related mental health issues, 988 is going to be the new number. So this is Amanda Gorman, and I want to end on a high note and just kind of say that when Michelle Obama had a piece in Time, December 7th of 2021, and she basically asked the poet laureate, how have you been able to manage and show up and write so beautifully and deliver such amazing addresses to so many people during this time of stress, during this time of COVID? How have you been able to do it? And Amanda said, touch trees. She says, I use touch trees. When I'm stumbling in the dark, all I can do is reach out sometimes and feel my way through. I am finding touch trees every day. And so I want to leave you with this thought, that when you are struggling and you are down and out, and as you move through your daily life with these youths that you love, as you work with City Club to think about policy, think about touch trees, because you too need to be cared for. You too need touch trees in your lives as you think about doing this work. Who's caring for the caregiver? Sometimes that means finding touch trees in each other. Thank you.
Well, Cicilline, this is really something. I'm left breathless, and I suspect many in our audience are too. In fact, I'm going to ask if Jane Frudenberger, she's been sort of tracking questions to make sure that we don't leave out questions that people may have on their mind right now, because you have covered so much really rich territory in your presentation.
There's a question about age range defining youth, and I just wanted to say that most of the presentation defines youth as 12 to 17, but I've got a whole resource slide that talks about it, because it's a really good question, because depending on the source, they talk about youth very differently. So sometimes they talk about youth as 12 to 17, sometimes they talk about youth as 11 to 15. There's no real standard definition of youth in some of these, but what I stuck to was SAMHSA, CDC, Mental Health America, which is a broad study, and the Healthy Mind study. All of those data points are going to be in my resource list, so that you'll be able to go back and literally deliver this presentation yourself if you want to, because you're going to find everything that I have in those spaces.
Yeah, I was going to say, I was looking at all the different numbers when someone asked that question about, and thought, wait a minute, what's the answer? So that is good.
Yeah.
One of the questions that came up was how parents can help their children develop healthy habits. And you talked about social media, but is that fast enough to protect the kids from the damage social media can do?
So that's a really good question. And I'm trying to remember the name of this, Bonnie. Okay, so CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. I'm going to give you two really insightful and good CBT ways to think about helping your children slow it down. Because it's all about helping your children kind of slow down the brain processes and get present. And they might seem a little cheesy, but I think they actually work. I've used them with my own kids. I've actually downloaded the Calm app for my own kids on their phones. And I've encouraged them to take moments and take breaks away from social media. I've encouraged them to listen to the Calm app before bed and listen to soothing music, just so that they can slow their nervous system down. There is a Bonnie Zucker. She's an amazing CBT therapist who deals with children and anxiety. And there are two, I'll drop her name in the chat. There are two, if you look her up, there are two strategies that she offers that I think are pretty brilliant. One is, it's a breathing technique. So you take you do this with your kid. You take your hand and you close one nostril and you breathe in for 5. And you breathe out for 7. You breathe in for 5. And you breathe out for 7. And then you switch and you do it on the other side. And what that does is it slows the brain down and it helps them get present. And you can practice that. And the good thing about this is a strategy that they can employ anywhere, whether they're feeling anxiety for a test, whether they're feeling stress as they're going to school, regardless of where they are, they can take this breathe break. There's another strategy. If I could lay down, I would show you. But one of the things that also happens, right? I'm about to get real dramatic, but I'm not going to do that. But if I could show you anxiety breathing, it's chest breathing. And what you do with your kid is you say, lay down, I'm going to put this phone, or maybe a phone is a bad idea, right? I'm going to put maybe this plant or this book on your belly, and we're going to do diaphragmatic breathing. And you challenge them to breathe in. So I'm breathing now, same intensity as I was when you saw my chest, but I'm not breathing through my chest. I'm doing diaphragmatic breathing. And it forces kids to slow down. It really gets them centered and in the moment because they're focused. And what they'll do when you have them laying on the bed or the floor and the book's there, you'll see the book. You'll know they're doing the diaphragmatic breathing when the book does this. And what you're looking for is for the chest to relax. Because this is what they're doing. This is what everybody's doing, shallow breathing. Everybody's doing this. You're doing it right now. When you do the diaphragmatic breathing, it's mindful. You're like, huh. Now I have to think about it. Now I have to get centered. There's one more I'm going to give you. I said two, I lied. Okay, here's one more. This one is a little more intense, and it's going to sound probably not like a good idea, but here it is. And Bonnie Zucker swears by this technique. It's recording. So what it does is it uses the body's natural desire to habituate or be bored. So one of the things that you can do is you can play a recording. If you have a child who is experiencing anxiety, and let's say that anxiety is, I think my friend's going to beat me up, right? So you replay that over and over. I think my friend's going to beat me up. I think my friend's going to beat me up. And you let them record it, right? You let them record that over and over and over again, and you play it back and you just let them hear it over and over and over again. And then so if my friend beats me up, is that the worst thing that can happen? If my friend, and so you listen to this first recording of, I think my friend's going to beat me up. My friend's going to beat me up. And while it sounds really scary, the first 2 or 3 times they hear it, by the 10th time they hear it, they're tired of it. And they're like, can I please stop listening to this recording? And so you're like wanting you want your kid to habituate to it. And they eventually, like the brain says, I cannot no longer tolerate the thought of hearing my friend's gonna beat me up anymore. So now the anxiety sort of goes away, right? Because you have used the brain in a way that the brain is intended to use. It's sort of the way that we used to look at people in Starbucks when they didn't have, did they have the mask on? Yeah. Now we're all habituated. We're not doing this so much to each other because we've habituated to so many of those things. And so those are 3 or 4 tools that you might be able to use, not just with your kids, but also with yourself as you think about stress and anxiety. But it works really well with kids.
Okay. Well, going along with that a little bit is moving on to more adults, maybe, was Marina asked, she said, thank you for talking about love, even in the workplace. Do you find that some people object to this kind of touchy-feely approach? And if so, how do you overcome that?
So, I am surprised at how many people have responded favorably about my use of the word love.
Good.
And compassion in the workplace. And if I can't do that, I can't be here. So I am so clear about my role and my message, and that it has to be through the lens of compassion, because that's who I charge myself to be. That it is not a hard reach. It's not a reach for me. to lead with love and to lead with compassion. And so while often I do not get the public, sometimes I do, I don't get the public acknowledgement, but almost always a faculty member or a staff member or a student will do exactly what this person asked. They will come back and they will say, you mentioned love. I've never heard that in a meeting at Western. Thank you. I really needed to hear that today. That's the first time someone mentioned love to me today. I needed to hear that I ended a meeting with, I love you all and I hope to see you next time before. And I would hear people say, it's the first time in a long time someone said, I love you. And I think that while I know my work, I can understand data, I can do all of that stuff. What else can I bring to the table that might be missing? And I'm always looking to infuse a little bit of love into the conversation.
That's nice. Is it possible that the reported numbers of depression and mental illness are up because we're more aware of this now and adults are asking and the youth are more, maybe feeling more safe to disclose these emotional issues?
I think that, yes, I think that's possible. And I also think that it is likely that it's probably a both and. I think it's up because those that we were already seeing were wanting more visits. And I think that there are those that were sort of dealing with it on their own, who all of a sudden now realize it is okay to be not okay. And they're also coming. I think there's also a gross underreporting because there's a group of unhoused youth undocumented youth that we typically don't support and we don't often count, quite frankly. And they are finding their way certainly welcome in our spaces here at Western. So I think absolutely there's a likely underreporting, but the numbers in such a short period of time, our numbers are through the roof. We can't counsel our way out of this. I remember I used to work at American Psychological Association, and I remember then the CEO, the president of APA, having a talk and saying that if every therapist today graduated with their clinical degree, we would not have enough to meet the projected need in this country over the next 10 to 20 years. And we're still saying that, we're still having that conversation. And so it's not really about just counseling our way, which is why I think institutions are going to have to start thinking about more creative ways of infusing well-being into the culture.
Mm-hmm. So again and again, we hear that we just don't have enough mental health counselors. And one of the questions, this is kind of combining a couple, but was what is the situation at Western? I know the Bellingham School District has put a counselor, at least one in every school now. And how do we get more people into this field?
Goodness gracious, if I had the answer to that question, I wouldn't be on this Zoom, I'd be in Mars or somewhere. But I think there are a couple of things that I feel, but first I'll say sort of just based on the facts, we have about 15 counselors, including our 4 clinical PhD students that see clients. We have about 15,000 students, 13,100 thereabouts on this campus as of census day, about 2,000 on the peninsula and then on other campuses around in non-Bellingham campuses. And our therapists see the ones primarily on the Bellingham campus. I just launched a pilot fall to see by telehealth students in non-Bellingham campuses, because our graduate students are often pegged as not students because we don't think of their needs often when we're talking about students. If I were to hire 5 more counselors and be at 20 by 5 o'clock today, I would be able to fill their clinical load. Our clinical load index or our counselor load is above average. We are among the highest in the country. Our clinical load index is 133, which means nothing to most of you, but it basically means that we have a very high number of students per counselor. And not only that, we have very complex cases in Washington, very complex cases. And so as we move to integrate our student health center with, because they also do behavioral health. I have 2 psychiatric nurse practitioners over there, several psychiatrists on call that we use and consult with. We also have a University of Washington psychiatrist consulting line. We have a number of physicians that are also being cross-trained in behavioral health. And we've got our prevention and wellness team used to be separate from our counseling center. Now we are the counseling and wellness center because I am challenging us to think about well-being on a continuum. So students that are hurting don't have to think about whether they need to call prevention or whether they need to call the counseling center or whether they need to call the student health center. We take them in and we help figure out where they need to go. So really it's about multiple pathways and putting folks in and putting our students where they need to be. And then the other part was that, how do you get people in? So I'm going to say, I know we're still recording, but I used to work at APA, American Psychological Association. And I think that I am going to go on record to say that APA has not been as nimble about cross-training and certification programs as some of our other industries. I'm thinking about the education industry, or whatever you think about the, what was that group, Complete College America, where they came in and they did Teach for America. Whatever you think about Teach for America is not important, but what is important is that somebody saw a problem and they wanted to try something new. And I don't think APA is this very, very old kind of traditional institution has really come up with, there are about 4 or 5, maybe 5 recertification programs for people who want to go back and retrain in clinical, but then they're going to have to take off and work from their professional lives and do full-time internships. And that model is only a traditional model for you know, young folks who are 20 and 5 years old and maybe haven't started their, you know, full-time career yet and want to go back and they have 3,000 hours that they can contribute working for free, which is kind of what happens for really cheap because you don't have a lot of money to pay interns. And so that is a serious concern in terms of how can the industry become more nimble and come up with creative ways to get more mental health professionals out there. And I will also say this, I do think the field of counseling has done a better job. I think counseling has done a better job at helping folks come out with the kinds of skill sets that help particularly college-age students, because when you're college-age students, you don't necessarily need to see a PhD psychologist in order to get treated for the kinds of things that are transitional and developmentally appropriate. You can see a master's level social worker, or you might be able to see a master's level counselor that can help with those issues and not have to worry about the thinking about medications management and those kinds of things. And so
well, it sounds like you're saying too that money is a big issue because I mean 3,000 or how many hours you said that you have to work for free. I mean, how can you do that when you're 22 years old and you're just starting out in life? You can't.
It's hard. It's really, really hard.
Tim, you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I have been following as closely as I can an emerging program proposal at the University of Washington, which would certify people to be mental health support intervention people who would not require a master's degree training. It's sort of getting Jane at your point about how incredibly expensive it is, both time-wise and financially, to get one of these advanced degrees. And yet there is growing evidence that people who are really good listeners and who are approachable could be very useful, particularly in quick interventions with people who are sort of on the cusp of potentially going in a more serious mental health crisis.
I think-
I would just be interested in knowing, Cicilline, what you think about that kind of program, because it would certainly add to resources that communities and families cannot afford right now.
Yeah, I think that's right. In fact, those have sort of just exploded since the pandemic. There are several that I can think of that are out there offering sort of good listener support teams. And, the clinical staff are often, it's a field, right? They're often pretty skeptical about having good listeners in places where you have to rely on folks who are brand new and who are just curious and want to listen to make a clinical diagnosis and not really know when to make that pivot to a mental health professional that kind of goes beyond the scope of what they can handle. And so I think that's always the conversation in the room. And that is when the listener is doing their work, quality control around what it means to make that shift from I'm listening with my non-clinical ears, and I may not know when that shift happens. And so I think that there's this balance that has to happen because we've absolutely explored it. And because I think the preponderance of students, could benefit from that. So we've explored a coaching model where we have peer coaches trained on campus, graduate students that are trained as peer coaches. We've explored an after hours model because most emergency happen after 5 o'clock on Fridays and usually 2 a.m. on a Saturday. So we've explored a model where we don't have a 9 to 5 because most crises just don't happen during that time. So we're looking at all kinds of models, including that non-clinical approach. We've actually just put in a state request for a basic needs group. And what that essentially will do, if funded, is provide a group of social workers, which we don't have now, who are going to essentially be navigators, because what we know is that a lot of the stress for students happen around the financial piece and around the unhoused piece and around the insecurity piece. A lot of anxiety and depression makes these students even more vulnerable. And a lot of those systems that are not shored up make these students more vulnerable for anxiety and depression. So we're exploring many of those models. So that support practitioner model is a really good idea that we're thinking about.
What can you say more then about the Okanagan model that you're working on and some of the institutions that are involved, because there are other higher ed institutions, right? And then especially as a part of that, how does the community become engaged? How do you get the broader community? Because that's where there are so many parents or grandparents like me and others who are so anxious that they will fail to note alert signs, that they'll pick up the phone and call the 988 number and either won't get an answer or there can't be a quick response, even if the phone is answered. What do you see as in ways in which you in your position and what you're trying to develop at Western can really fully engage the community to be this productive?
Yeah, so I'll answer the first question first. And I'll tell you that there are two ways to answer that. We have a network of schools, a United States Health Promoting Campus network of schools that meets every month. And our sole intent is to get schools across the country to adopt the charter, to become health promoting campuses. The first school to adopt was the University of Alabama at Birmingham. That was December of 2020. September of 2021, the first cohort of schools that adopted included Northern Illinois University, University of Alabama State, University of New York, University of California, Berkeley, University of California, Irvine, University of Michigan, University of North Florida, and Western. So we are now 8 schools, and we are looking at a cohort this year of at least 11 schools that are going to be adopting. We are working right now, I've got about 20 people on the Okanagan Charter work group, and we're going to be building out a team that is going to include, I am hoping, some folks from City Club. We're looking for partners in the community who will be able to sit on our work group. And we're going to probably call it a well-being collective. We'll come up with a fancier name than work group. But I started with work group because I didn't want it to be any confusion about what we were going to be doing initially as we think about those 4 pillars. And so this work group comes together and we meet twice a month to talk about how we're going to expand, to do work in the community, bring the community in, to help parents, to help grandparents, to help other institutions in the community work with us as we think about sustainable efforts, how we deal with our land, because it's not just, we think about our 4 pillars, it is about sustainability and equity and person, place, and planet as our anchors in thinking about the way that we do our work. And so, and I'm thinking about the people in our executive team because I chaired the diversity and social justice, the diversity, social justice, and inclusion subcommittee on the U.S. Health Community Campus Network. And I'm channeling one of my team members who always says, the Okanagan Charter well-being work is not mental health, but mental health is a really important part of it. It is well-being in the sense that we are trying to think about the work that we do as health promotions and creating communities of well-being so that we can help those siloed places when we think about the Student Health Center and the Counseling Center. They need help. And so, stay tuned because I would love to get some feedback and some interest from our community partners who want to work with us and help us, on our blind sides. I mean, I'm new to this community. I'm a transplant from the East Coast. I've only been here 2 years, so there are so many things that I can learn about working in Whatcom County and how Western, I think, can be a better partner in different areas of Whatcom County. So I'm excited to get the work and to invite the community in closer.
One other question I'd like to ask is a soccer granddad. And soccer's been rampant in our family for a long time.
Okay.
Our granddaughter have played since they were very young. Where can you talk about physical activity and the encouragement of physical action? Because between the energy it uses and also the sense of team and belonging that it can produce, depending on the kinds of activities, does it make any difference in this wellness idea that you're talking about?
It makes all the difference. So I talk about sleep, physical activity, and food. If we can nail those 3 things down, we are doing, but that is the beginning of good health. I think sports have so many lessons, and I use I can use a football analogy for anything because my kids have played football and basketball, and just the act of engaging and working out we'll talk about the physical benefits, working out creates endorphins and hormones. And when you are looking at your granddaughter, and for those of you who have children and grandchildren, when you're looking at them on the field, there's a point at which they almost disappear into the game. And that's called flow. And that's often the time when their endorphins have really taken over and they are just in it. They are immersed. And all of those feel-good hormones and endorphins that flood the brain. If you could look at the brain activity, it would be beautifully lit, a beautiful light that would show that they are doing everything that they can do to take care of heart health because they're doing cardio, to take care of brain health because they're getting endorphins. They're taking care of their cardio. All of the blood is flowing through their veins. And so it is just really good. In terms of the benefits of team sports, I mean, not all sports are team sports, but the benefits of team sports, there's just very few things that you cannot learn about leadership and living and learning and loving that doesn't come out of the analogies in team sports. Team sports are an amazing protective factor when you're talking about young adults. The other thing that it does is it's considered in higher ed speak, it's considered on high impact practices. So what we know is that students that are more engaged are more likely to persist, are likely to have better grades, and they're more likely to graduate because they find a community. And so what I say to parents is, if you are looking for one way to get your student engaged, say you're moving to another town, or say your student is graduating from high school, if I could give that one piece of advice, it would be to find a community quickly, whether that community is band, which is a sport, I play band, whether it's band, whether it is soccer, whether it is softball, whether it is the debate team, find a way for your student to get connected with the community. Because just kind of lingering out there on their own, trying to figure it out, they're shedding their protective factors of home, right? They come home, they're in community. They need to be able to replicate community outside of your community. And that's what team sports does so beautifully.
You're a good promoter. We have just a few minutes left. I want to, Jane, turn back to you just to make sure that if there are any questions lingering amongst our audience or others that they
No.
can be raised.
Can you hear me?
We can.
I think we covered all the audience questions that I have, Tim. Just the one thing that I love this question because I've had this problem myself at times. How do we tell the difference between true mental health problems and just a moody teenager?
Yeah. Sometimes it can be hard to tell the difference. The clinical definition, if I were a clinician, I'm channeling all my clinical friends. I do the research on the work that they implement in the chair. They would say that a sustained mood pattern beyond 2 weeks, say 2 to 3 weeks, if you can't find a way to lift their mood or spirits and it's prolonged for 2 weeks, then you know that it's a slippery slope, that they might be slipping into a depression. It's also noteworthy to mention that if a student or young adult, really however you define it, if your youth has lost interest in something that interests them. So if all of a sudden Tim's granddaughter came home and no longer wanted to play soccer, that's an immediate trigger. That's like, okay, something is going on. We need to make sure that we arrest this pattern because we don't need to see this for 2 weeks. We know that there's something going on. The breakups are a big deal, right? I don't believe in puppy love. I think love is love. I think you love somebody, you really do care for them. I do think that there's this phase at which you might think that I do believe, I know what infatuation is, but I do believe that young people can love. And so I think that that is often the time where you have to kind of pay attention and help to guide and put in perspective what is going on. I remember for every kid of mine, I was sitting on the floor with them and crying with them during a breakup or their first heartbreak. So being able to zone in and just give them full on attention. And if that doesn't do it, it is recognizing that they might need additional support and holding their hand as you guide them to that support and saying, listen, I know this might be scary, but I'm going to do this with you. You're right. So it could be that you go into the room with your kid, a young adult, the first time, and that's okay until you're ready to let go, right? There is no prescription for how this works best. How it works best is how you believe that it works best. And now I'm going to say, as I channel my professional colleagues that would say, and there's a point at which during individuation, as your kid wants to let go, just like they do in the doctor's office, you give them those wings that you have so skillfully built and allow them to fly. And so you let them go. And you're like, I'm right here, but I need you to be able to have this private conversation because you might want to talk about me. And I need you to be able to do that freely. I need you to be able to talk about me in ways that I might not be able to handle it. And so go in that space and share. There is no shame in seeking support. I encourage it, I support it. But you gotta have some ego shedding to be able to say that. I need you to go away and talk about me, because that might be hard for some people.
Well, I have to tell you that that is really an uplifting concluding note, I think, really, to this very important topic. You know, our committee just struggled over this because it's not like people don't recognize that mental health, mental well-being is critical, but how to grapple with it for all of us individually is a challenge. And you have been quite inspiring, very informative.
Thank you so much, Tim, and thank you for the opportunity to share with an amazing group. And I hope that this is just the beginning and that we'll have more conversations as we talk about how we can make ourselves better, how we can make Bellingham better, how we can spread some love. Okay, so there are some crisis resources that are here. There's a 24/7 crisis hotline, 1-800-584-3578. There's a crisis text line. Text home to 741-741, the suicide prevention line, which will be 988 as of July 1st, hopefully in Washington State, but right now it is 800-273-8225. And then the most important veterans crisis line that I didn't highlight, 1-800-273-8255. And those of you who are interested in supporting your teen and adults, teen and young adults, 1-800-448-3000. For those who might be listening but may not be able to see, domestic violence hotline. I've done quite a bit of work with domestic violence. It looks like many things, right, with youth, and also can be a sign that your kid's in trouble. 360-715-1563. Most important thing you can give to a person in a domestic violence relationship is encouraged to make a plan. LGBTQ youth hotline. 866-488-7386, LGBTQ National Hotline, 888-843-4564. What Community Detox, 360-812-7220. And there is a mental health first aid, which might have just been way too clinical for you all, but this is an upcoming training at Friday Harbor, Compass training at Compass Health, compassh.org. Those, they are amazing partners.
Thank you again.
Thank you very much.